Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
We're all aware of the stories about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but maybe not about the places that shaped life in those times. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. We often pass by those sites as we drive through Delmarva without even imagining what they may have been like in the mid-1800s as the nation moved closer to the Civil War. Jim Duffy has authored a new book about those sites entitled 32 Underground Railroad Journeys on Delmarva, Tubman Travels. In the book, he takes us through the stories and the sites that make up that era. We have him in the studio this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Don.
So tell me then a little bit about what was the inspiration for doing this book?
My inspiration for doing this book is really related to a guy who passed away a couple of years ago. John Creighton was a historian based in Dorchester County. Kind of a self-trained historian who really did a lot of the foundational work for turning the story of Harriet Tubman from the myths that had passed through time into facts based on actual research. And I got to know John after moving to Cambridge in 2004. I was part of his monthly Harriet Tubman discussion group for a long time and things like that. And as I looked for a second book project to take on, this just kept kind of coming to the surface for a lot of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss as we continue forward.
Were you, before you did this book, were you aware physically of all the places, or was that a discovery process?
I was. There's one particularly memorable moment that I talk about in the book where John and his partner Pat Lewis and I and a group of other people all got in the car after one of these discussion group meetings and went down into South Dorchester County and ended up on Harrisville Road, which is a 2-lane road that goes to a 1-lane road that goes to a dirt road and then goes for a long, long way. And that, at the end of that dirt road, is where historians currently believe that the cabin where Harriet Tubman was born is. And that's one of the interesting things about these sites is some of them are a little bit out of the way, and some of them, most of them, in fact, are kind of unlike traditional travel destinations. It's not like going to Monticello or something like that where you're putting your hands on things, because all these slave cabins are gone and people don't precisely know which route people took. And it's more about looking out at a landscape, and I think you used the word in your introduction, imagining what went there. And that's what my book, Tubman Travels, is really all about, is helping people look out at, for many of us, a familiar landscape and seeing it in a new way that really reflects what was going on in the 1850s.
You begin with actually an extensive discussion of the Middle Passage and where the boat that brought the first, I guess, relative for Harriet Tubman to the shore. Tell us a little bit about that, and why did you emphasize that particular Middle Passage? Because there's a lot of description about on the way, not just where you were, and where did it dock?
Harriet Tubman was third generation here. Her grandmother came here aboard a slave ship, and it's very difficult to sort of track exactly where that slave ship went. In all likelihood, it came up the Choptank River. It's possible that it turned and went to Oxford. They had a good number of slave sales there. Cambridge had a few less slave sales here. But what I talk about in that chapter is just how sort of, it's one thing to talk about sailing across the ocean, but the conditions on these ships were just unfathomable. And I thought that's actually chapter 1 in the book, and I have you on a lighthouse on the Choptank River looking upriver and trying to imagine that ship coming in. Another reason to emphasize that is the fact that she's third generation. Frederick Douglass, another famous Delmarva person, is fifth generation, actually, on Delmarva. And I think that was one of the things I learned in the book, was I came into the book somehow in my mind thinking of white families and white people as being established and kind of rooted here, while the black people were sort of newcomers and transplants. And that actually turned out often not to be the case. In fact, Harriet Tubman has a very famous quote about there was a movement to kind of ship free blacks back to Africa at one point, the colonization movement it was called, and she was very much opposed to that. And her quote is, "We're rooted here, and they can't pull us up." And that was sort of the inspiration, I think, for positioning that Middle Passage journey by her grandmother in the very first chapter of the book.
So give us a sense about where she certainly was born, but where she lived, and particularly in terms of the landscape and where people were at that point.
Yeah, so I mentioned Harrisville Road. Her father was owned by a guy who was doing a lot of forestry work down there. Now, Harrisville Road, if people are familiar with South Dorchester, is kind of on the way to Taylor's Island. And Wolford General Store it's in that area way back in the forest. Her family for the first 8-ish years of her life was completely intact. A large family, a number of kids, 7 kids, I think it was, and the 2 parents were all together. That was all torn apart when she was 8 years old. Complicated estate situation. Her owner turned 21 and took control of her mother and the children while the father was retained under his owner. And so he pulled that family away to a town of Bucktown, again in South Dorchester, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. There's a plantation there that you can kind of look over an old plantation house that's associated with her. There's also the Bucktown General Store. There is an old 1850s, 1860s general store building where a very important thing happened in her life. And that 3 of her sisters during this period were sold off into slavery, and she was pulled away from her father. There's one historian who's sort of, Jean Humez is her name, who positions this as the real defining moment in her life, that she was the Humpty Dumpty child who kind of spent the rest of her life trying to put her family back together again after enduring this at the age of 8 or 9. And most, in fact, of her trips back from the north much later in life were attempts to rescue her family members, and other people would kind of pop up, or she wouldn't be able to find the family member and she'd pick up other people. But family was her motivation throughout her life.
So, in fact, we alluded to, there was the incident in the village store. Describe for me that particular incident, where it was, and if we go there now, what do we see?
Yeah. You see a store building, kind of a large one-room store building, that is very much like what would have been there on the day that young Harriet Tubman came to visit. The building is either the original building or it's a building built on the precise same foundation. And it is, I mentioned earlier about imagining and not being like Monticello. This is one of the places where you can genuinely feel like you're walking in her footsteps, for sure. It's that sort of a building. This was the site of her first known act of defiance. She ran an errand to the store from the nearby plantation where she was living, and she got caught in the middle of a situation. And a slave overseer was chasing a young enslaved boy and ordered Harriet Tubman to stop that boy, and she flat out refused. That overseer then threw a 2-pound hardware store kind of weight at the boy, missed him, hit Harriet Tubman in the head, and very nearly killed her. She was working on flax at that time, and I'm not real familiar with that, but apparently it's really dirty work, and she was really self-conscious about the way that her hair looked. So she was wearing kind of a turban over her head, and she always said, I think it's that there scarf saved my life. She spent a year, perhaps even more, in recovery, lost a lot of weight. She was already small-statured. And the historian Kate Clifford Larson has done a great detective work. So for most of the rest of her life, Tubman experienced visions, heard voices, and succumbed to episodes of narcolepsy, suddenly falling asleep. And that hit on the head she took is consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy, which would be a physical disease that manifests itself in exactly those things, visions and voices and sleeping episodes. And what makes the story especially interesting in the end is that through most of her adult life, this woman of incredible faith took those voices and those visions and the dream she had during those sleeping episodes to be direct communication from God. And heeding those messages and interpreting them in her own way and following them basically always worked out perfectly for her, which is why I title the chapter about this episode, God Works in Mysterious Ways.
Now, she begins to, of course, she decides to make her first foray out of slavery, that is, to escape. Tell us a little bit about that, and where would that be located?
Yeah, she was living in Caroline County at that time, probably very near a cabin, one-room cabin that her parents had on a place called Poplar Neck, which is below Preston, very near the small waterfront town of Choptank. She was married at this point to a guy named John Tubman. Her owner had died, and there was great fear that in the process of the estate they were going to unload some property, including her and perhaps her brothers. What I got into in more depth than I had perhaps when I started the book coming into is the fact that there was a first failed escape in which she got two of her brothers and they went off on their own. And the brothers got very scared, and the brothers kind of forced her to turn back. And that's very interesting to me because you can look at that as, oh, her brothers were kind of chicken or didn't have the courage that she had, but it's also, the way I kind of grew to look at it is, she wasn't ready to escape at that point. She had no connections on the Underground Railroad. She just packed up and left out of the blue with those two brothers, and they're wandering around the landscape they know nothing about. They don't have any station they're going to. They don't have anything. And that turning around and coming back the next time when she did successfully escape, she did so with the help of a nearby Quaker woman who connected her with the Underground Railroad. And her journey is a bit of a mystery. She went from station to station, but it's not clear which house and which river and what all went down. And when she got across, almost the first thought, as she recalled it later in life, the first thought she had was I'm free, and now my family needs to be free.
By the way, what would that have been like for her to make that trip? Because obviously she's making it, well, I assume, certainly in large part on foot. We know that they were transported on the Underground Railroad through wagons every once in a while, right? Mm-hmm. What would that have been? She would travel at night? If so, what would that landscape have looked like?
Yeah, that...
That's pretty daunting.
It is very daunting, and I have some. One of the things I do in the book is try to get voices from the period into the book from old slave narratives, including escape narratives. And there's some horrifying things about being tracked down by dogs, experiencing really horrible weather, not even knowing where this thing called Pennsylvania is. And you're in most cases, the guess among historians is that they kind of followed riverbanks, stayed away from towns. But there are also exceptions to that. And there was one escape involving Seaford, Delaware, where she took a steamship from Baltimore down to the Nanticoke River and up to Seaford because she didn't have the right paperwork to go directly from Baltimore to. So it varied greatly, but without a doubt, it was a terrifying prospect at almost every turn.
So, well, you mentioned the steamboat. What seems to be, and I think you say this in the book itself, is that all the kind of various tricks and quickness
Yes.
of mind that she had in order to get past everyone. Discover that force. That's fascinating.
There were some incredible tricks. Gosh, you could just kind of tick them off. So that was one. She didn't have the proper paperwork to go to bring a woman named Tilly to the north. So instead, in order to escape slavery, she actually went south because she didn't need the paperwork to go south, and got off somewhere in the south where she was able to connect with her Underground Railroad connections. There was an incident where she was walking through town disguised as one continuous theme, disguised as an old lady who had a couple of chickens with her, when she saw a white man who was either his master or an overseer or whatever threatening prospect might have been in front of her. And she basically kicked the chickens and went chasing after him, and the chickens are squawking and her head's down and everybody's laughing at this little old lady running through town, and the guy just walked right by. And there's another incident on a train in which she somehow she had a book with her, and she picked up the book because she had seen somebody else who might know her, and that person would immediately know that she didn't know how to read, and so she picked up the book in order to try to demonstrate that she could read. And she recounted later that she was just praying the book was upside down, instead of upside down, or whatever it was. So there's a million tricks like that in the book, and then there's also times when she's kind of out of tricks, and all she does, there's two particular, maybe three occasions in the book where she's completely out of tricks. She has nothing. She is trapped, and she gets down on her knees and prays, and once again, that works out pretty well for her.
So she does initially. She does get to the north. I think it's Baltimore, is it? And she finds obviously that she's happy about freedom, but then there's another emotion that sets in, and something that's actually reflected, I think, also in Frederick Douglass as well.
Yes, the contrast between Douglass and Tubman is really interesting. I mentioned that Tubman's family was intact and then ripped apart. Douglass was kind of the reverse. His family was never intact at all. He barely knew his mother, barely knew his siblings, and had a completely broken family situation. When she got to the north, I'm trying to remember the precise phrase that she used, because it's so appropriately for someone at the bottom of society, of American society, and that's, she sort of channels Patrick Henry, and her quote is, I could have two things. I could have liberty or I could have death, and I'm determined to have one of them. And that was how she reflected on her journey. And then again, we get back to the family issue, because that was the primary thing that she became much of her life's mission during the 1850s after her escape, was bringing her entire family up north. And she very nearly succeeded in bringing everyone. One sister tragically died before Tubman got a chance to bring her up.
I mean, the thing I think about is that she expressed that she realized that she was alone. There was a certain loneliness that took place.
Yes, thank you.
And Douglas expresses something similar
Douglas
in the sense of no connection. Yeah, tell us a
a
little bit.
whole bunch of the slaves. The book includes not just Tubman and Douglas, but a number of other stories, and that is one of the terrifying prospects of going on the Underground Railroad. Is you are going someplace where you know no one. You're going someplace where you've heard legends that there may be people to help you, but you don't have any idea whether they are true. And you're going someplace where all the bonds of family, spouse, and love, and friends, you are walking away from all those things. Now, I came away from this book, one of the sort of surprise, revelations, let's say, to me, was just how hard that decision could be. There are stories in the book of people who leave their children behind, much less their parents and their siblings. And that heading out away from all of those bonds of family was a really terrifying prospect. I ended up with a great respect and admiration, not just for the people brave enough to go, but also for the people brave enough to stay, if that makes any sense. I don't think there was a right decision. I don't think there was a wrong decision. It's beyond a catch-22. Some people decided to stay and maintain those bonds of family and friendship. even when they had the opportunity to escape. The sister that I mentioned who died was one of those. She made that choice a couple of different times, declining to join Harriet Tubman on the trip north because she was unable in that given moment to collect her children and bring them with her.
One of the things that she has in common with Frederick Douglass is that Douglass seems to be, at various points in his life, very rebellious in the sense of rejecting authority. At one point, he's beaten down, but then he comes back and he strikes. I think he actually strikes one of his the overseer, if not the master. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, if you're in such an oppressive state, I mean, it's where everybody else controls everything and very violently controls everything. So it's not just being told. And yet you find people like Douglass or Tubman with her incident in the store just snatching that one moment.
It's incredible. Again, it's kind of like these stories, because they are set during slavery and slavery is at the heart of the stories. They, for all the obvious reasons, reflect the very worst of America. But in the way that you're talking about here, they also reflect the very sort of best of American values and traditions. And I mentioned the one with Harriet Tubman and the liberty or death quote about kind of channels Patrick Henry, but Douglass and Tubman, for her matter, do the same thing with that kind of Horatio Alger pull yourself up by your bootstraps business. Douglass had a very freewheeling childhood along Tuckahoe Creek in Talbot County, and he lived with his grandmother and grandfather. His mother was generally out of the picture, and he has really genuinely fond memories of the first 6 years of his life in slavery. You'd think that would be starting at the bottom, but in his mind, it was kind of starting at the top of life's roller coaster, if you will. The secret to where that pull yourself up from the bootstraps sort of miracle comes from is just a mystery. How do the people at the very, very, very bottom of society still those values somehow trickle down to them even through all of the oppression and violence they face? Douglass basically taught himself to read as a young boy. He had a white woman in Baltimore who taught him the letters of the alphabet. And then that woman's husband found out what he was doing and put a stop to it. And he took that basic knowledge of the letters of the alphabet and turned it into reading Greek and Roman oratory as a young teenager over the matter of a couple of years. He did it by himself. I don't know that there's a greater pull yourself up by your bootstrap story than Frederick Douglass in kind of all the annals of American history. I really don't.
You mentioned, by the way, in the books, as a matter of fact, he wrote, I guess, his 3 biographies, and you mentioned that his view of his time in slavery, and particularly his former master, that they seemed to soften. Matter of fact, he even visits, I think, at one point after the Civil War, his former master. Tell us about that journey that you did, because most of us will read one or the other, but it went out with all 3 of them, you know?
Harriet Tubman never came back to Maryland, as far as anyone knows. Douglass came back on a number of times. So he wrote 3 separate versions of his autobiography. And as I'm sure most people listening know, he was easily the most famous black man of his time and one of the most famous men of his time for his accomplishments in the abolitionist movement as a speaker and writer. He famously wrote, I think it was in the 1840s, he wrote a letter to a slave master, which was addressed to his former owner, and basically said, I'm going to use you as a weapon in the fight against this horrible evil. I don't know if he actually postmarked it to his owner. I do know he published it in newspapers all over the North. And he did do that. And he was really successful, and there's no doubt but that he was on the right side of history in that fight. But as he got older, he started to wonder if maybe he had taken things a little bit too far. And one particular occasion involves his former master's treatment of his grandmother. Now, she did not end up in some fancy assisted living facility like we have today, but by the standards of the time, she was treated decently. By the standards of the time, hasten to add. But in his first version of his autobiography, Douglas had accused his master of mistreating his grandmother and leaving her out in the cold when she was no longer able to work. And in his second autobiography, he toned that down a little bit. And in his third autobiography, he basically didn't make that accusation at all. And when he got word as an old man that his former master was about to die, he decided, incredibly to me, that he needed to go down to St. Michael's to apologize to him for making that false accusation. And he took a steamship from Baltimore. He had media was in tow with him. He's a very, very famous man, and went into a B&B, what is now a B&B on Cherry Street in St. Michael's, and did indeed apologize to his former master. They had other parts of the great conversation. He got actually in all kinds of trouble for that. There was a cartoon that ran in newspapers all over the South of Frederick Douglass, the great Frederick Douglass, on his knees begging the forgiveness of his former master. The New York Times editorialized that Frederick Douglass's time as a leader of his race is about played out. And to Douglass's credit, in my mind, he kind of dismissed all that as so much media background noise. And I think when I got to a point in the book when I was kind of done reading about Frederick Douglass and needed to start writing about it, I remember turning to my wife and just sort of shaking my head and going, what a decent man. I mean, to have fought the good fight and have done all the great things that he did, and then at the end of his life say, you know, I really got to go back and apologize to that SOB. It's just sort of an incredible decision and reflects the basic decency of the man.
What was the relationship between Tubman and Frederick Douglass?
They were, there was no relationship that is known while they were on the Eastern Shore. In the North, they became acquaintances and friends of a sort. They knew each other. There were a lot of sort of conventions of abolitionists and conventions with black people that sometimes Tubman attended and more often Douglass attended. When it came time when, during Tubman's lifetime, a woman wrote a book about her life based on conversations with her. And, you know, I have quotes from the back of a book jacket about how this book is going to be great and all that. In the modern day, they did a version of that inside the book back in those days. And Frederick Douglass wrote an incredible letter of reference for Harriet Tubman, in which he compares and contrasts how he got to stand up in pulpits and on stages and publish newspapers and do everything in public light and kind of a safe atmosphere, while she was out in the middle of nowhere with no one to help her and nothing to do, and no options except to count on the good graces of God, with these poor people carrying her hands, and how she has no greater admirer in the world than he does. It was basically the greatest letter of reference I've ever read.
Because you should mention, by the way, that while Douglass was extremely literate and wrote well, of course, she was illiterate.
She was illiterate throughout her life.
Yeah, but it's a real
all
contrast.
the way to the end. It really is.
So, by the way, I can't let you go. Samuel Green. Tell me, he spent some time in prison.
Yes.
Reading or with a copy of for a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which
Yes.
Apparently then he went spent some time with in terms of prison and that kind of thing. And one would think that as we look back from this vantage point, owning a book or possessing a book like that would not necessarily be something that you would necessarily go to jail for. But at the time,
Yeah. So Reverend Samuel Green was born into slavery around East Newmarket. And he grew up to become a lay minister in his church. It's a congregation that actually still meets in East Newmarket. There's a marker outside of the church at Railroad Avenue as you drive through East Newmarket on the highway. It's off to the right behind the railroad tracks. He had two sons. He and his wife had two children, a son and a daughter. And he was almost certainly a conductor on the Underground Railroad who helped people escape. His son escaped. So his son and his daughter, he eventually, his master willed him to freedom. And he was able to buy his wife's freedom. But the children remained enslaved, and they got moved into a house on High Street in Cambridge, where things did not go well. The son later recalled whippings and all kinds of horrible things happening in that house. That's where he ran from, the son, Sam Green Jr., and he ran to Canada, and he made it. And he wrote a letter back home to tell his parents that everything was okay. And his parents were also planning to go visit him, so they had various travel schedules to Canada and things like that. Reverend Green had a wonderful description of what it was, the decision that his son made in trying to escape. He said he prayed with his legs. I titled the chapter about this, The Price of Freedom, because Sam Green Jr. paid a real price for running away. His sister was sold off. She was married and had children, was sold off by herself to Missouri and never heard from again. His father was arrested for being an activist on the Underground Railroad, but they didn't really find very much evidence against him. But they did find that letter that Sam Jr. wrote, and they found some train schedules to Canada. And as you mentioned, they found a copy of a bestseller at the time, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. He ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison in Baltimore. So their life was torn apart as well. This was a big cause célèbre at the time. All the abolitionists in the North were trying to get clemency for Sam Green Jr. because he was in prison basically for owning a book that everybody in the North had in their homes. Eventually did after 5-ish years. The Maryland governor released him from prison on the condition that he leave Maryland and never set foot again. On his journey to the north, where he's flat broken, has some health issues, he starts giving speeches in some churches and things. During his stop in New York City, he actually got the opportunity to meet Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she later wrote in a newspaper column, it was a column, one of these, this subject, that subject, another subject kind of newspaper columns, and down towards the bottom is like, so I met this minister from Maryland who was in prison, spent 5 years in prison, she goes into what an ordeal that must have been, and then concludes, but he carried this was all his part of the cross, and he just carried it with him. The only thing he asked of me is if I could give him a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, because he never got a chance to actually read the book.
We were speaking with Jim Duffy. He's author of a new book, and it's entitled 32 Underground Railroad Journeys on Delmarva, Tubman Travels. We appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.